Hello and welcome to the third webinar in our series Person-Centred Care in Practice. My name is Anna Flynn and I work at the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare. Now, before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the different lands on which we meet today. For me, that's Gadigal land, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. And I would also like to extend that acknowledgement and respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. Now, before I introduce our presentation today, I just wanted to remind you about our resource hub on our website, where you can find all things person-centred care, including the previous webinar recordings. And remember to join our network. The next newsletter will be out shortly. And if there's anything you'd like to share in that newsletter, please do get in touch. So just a bit of housekeeping before I introduce our speakers today. After the presentation, there'll be a live Q&A, so please type your questions in the Q&A function. And also, at the end of the webinar, you'll be sent a short survey, and as always, we'd really appreciate your feedback on today's event. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce James Sanderson, Director of Community Health Services and Personalised Care at NHS England, who'll be talking to us about how they have implemented a comprehensive model of personalised care. After his presentation, James will be joining us for a live Q&A, along with Elaine Cross, who works as a peer leader with lived experience in the NHS England, and Sian Slade, Project Founder and Chair of Navigating Health. So, over to you, James.
Hello, my name is James Sanderson. I'm Director of Community Health Services and Personalised Care for the NHS in England, and I'm going to be talking about our journey in developing a universal model for personalised care, and not just the rationale for why we did it, but some of the challenges that we faced along the way and where we're at now with that journey. Firstly, just wanted to thank you for this invite. It's great to be speaking to colleagues in Australia. I've been doing a lot of work with colleagues across Australia in various aspects of personalised care and do have family connections to Australia. I'm even sitting in front of a picture of the beach in Cottesloe in Western Australia, which I thought would be a good position for me for this recording, to have a bit of Australia in the background. So personalised care in the NHS. So we started developing the way in which we deliver personalised care back in 2015. And what we found there, and this is a challenge that you'll recognise as universal across not just England, but in Australia as well. We found that, whilst we had the benefit of living longer lives, we know that there's still big issues in society in relation to health inequality between the richest and poorest in society, 10 to 15 year gap in mortality, but also a 10 to 15 year gap in healthy living as well. And we also found that actually what we noted in terms of the health system was that whilst the health system was working incredibly well, where we were talking about transactional health, whether that was visiting a GP for a prescription, for a drug to cure yourself of a particular illness, or it was going to secondary care for some fairly significant treatment, there was still an element of transactionality about it. And that transactional healthcare system is fundamentally what we were reliant on. However, what that healthcare system was failing to address was the support for those people living with multimorbidity, those people living with complexity in their lives. And actually that issue was really at the heart of the health disparity that we had, this sort of 10 to 15 year age gap. So how did we support that? How could we get to people in their health trajectory to be able to provide them with proactive support to live healthy lives? So we started to look at what was happening, and we found that across the country there were lots of approaches to personalised care. There were lots of approaches to sort of proactive support for people, and those approaches effectively were creating changes in the relationship between the healthcare system and individuals. But these approaches had grown up in a fairly fragmented fashion. They'd grown up in pockets of practice, mainly led by, really forward-thinking clinicians or forward-thinking healthcare workers that basically wanted to change the system, wanted to engage with patients in a different way. We also knew the evidence didn't point towards a system where patients were involved. 40% of people said that they weren't as involved in their health and care as they would like to have been. And, if you pause and think about that, 40% of people not being involved in some of the most sensitive personal aspects of their life is too huge a statistic. We also knew that 40% of people didn't necessarily understand the health information that they were provided. And actually 40% of people living with long-term conditions said that they lacked the skills, knowledge and confidence to live with those long-term conditions, know how to manage them. So this was the circumstances. So what we did is we looked at all of those fragmented things that were going, and we started to pull it together. We did a program of extensive co-production across the whole of the country. We spoke to thousands of people. We spoke to service users, we spoke to clinicians, we spoke to social workers, we spoke to people involved in healthcare commissioning and management. We brought communities together and we engaged in a massive program of co-production to look at how we could structure health in a different way. And the consequence of that was that we developed the comprehensive model for personalised care. So the comprehensive model starts on the basis that actually we've got 3 layers of support that are required. There's support that's needed for the whole population, there's support for the people living with one or more multi-morbidity, long-term conditions, and the support for those people that live with the greatest level of complexity in their lives. And you need to have sort of a tiered system of support to reflect that gradient of support that's required. We also developed 6 key domains. So what we wanted to do was settle on what are the things that are going to have the biggest impact, what are the things that are evidence-based, what are the things that we can do with patients that are going to change their health. And we came up with these 6 domains, which I'll just spend a little bit of time talking you through. So the first element is shared decision-making. How can we change the clinical conversation from one that focuses on what's wrong with an individual by moving to a position of what matters to you, which obviously you'll all be familiar with, I'm sure. But actually that fundamental shift, asking that question, what matters to you, starting to change the way in which we structure conversations in clinical practice, and how we can use tools like structured decision support tools to talk to people about various care and treatment options is something that's really, really key. And interestingly, we know that the evidence supports this, because if you have a shared decision-making conversation with someone, you can reduce costly and risky treatments by about 20%. And we've done a lot of work even in areas like elective care for people waiting on elective wait lists for musculoskeletal conditions, where we found that having a structured shared decision-making conversation can actually take around 7% of people off that waiting list. So, not only is this right for patients in enabling them to make different decisions, but it's also right for the health system in that it's not incurring unnecessary cost. So starting with shared decision-making is that sort of fundamental principle of personalised care. Linked to that, choice. So offering people a real choice in health is, quite a challenge. What are we talking about in terms of choice? Are we talking about choice of going for an operation at hospital A or hospital B? Are we talking about choice of whether to take a particular drug or not? Are we talking about choice of treatment options for various forms of cancer? Maybe looking at the balance of treatment now or watch and wait, maybe looking at various aspects of risk regarding progression of particular illnesses and diseases. That sort of element of choice across all of that spectrum is really, really important. So we looked at how we could enhance choice, both through legal rights to have, through better technology to support those choices being made, so that when people were sitting with their GP, they could see waiting lists for particular hospitals, they could see the benefits of treatment, the outcomes of treatment in various locations. So improving, enhancing choice to give people that proper decision making, so that it wasn't just a very narrow decision, it was actually a decision that people could make fully informed by the potential options that were in front of them. Then the next progression of the model beyond those 2 is actually a personalised care and support plan. So we know that people living with long-term conditions, or people at various points in their life, whether that's somebody having cancer, somebody who's pregnant, or somebody that's at the end of their life, we know that having a plan in order to guide their care and treatment is incredibly important, not just to enhance the outcomes that they have, but also to better coordinate services across the various aspects of care that they're having, because a lot of healthcare systems work in a very siloed nature. We work in clinical specialism, and we sometimes assume that someone will have cancer on a Tuesday and mental health issues on a Thursday, because of the way in which we structure healthcare systems, not around people's lives. So flipping this around and having a personalised care and support plan in order to ensure that people's lives and the complexity of their lives is reflected in their treatment plans is something that's really important. And that's also an aspect of looking beyond the health situation that presents. So it may be that somebody isn't able to engage in treatment because they're a carer themselves. So actually they've been refusing certain treatment, but that's because they have other responsibilities in their life. They have other challenges in getting to those appointments, perhaps. It's also about trying to find the root cause of things. So by undertaking a personalised care and support plan, do you find out that the person that you're treating for a respiratory illness, who's on steroids and various inhalers to support the respiratory condition, is actually living in accommodation that has mold growing up the walls? And actually the issue is that we need to sort the accommodation out, not necessarily treat the respiratory infections that they're getting. So how can you look holistically at somebody's life and somebody's needs through personalised care and support planning? And we also know the evidence is there. People at the end of their life, if you have a plan for managing your end of life care, on average, we see that people will have one admission to hospital in their last 12 months of life, but it can be up to 8 and 9 times for somebody that doesn't have a plan. And nobody wants unnecessary admission and hospital stays during their last 12 months of life. Beyond this starting point, these fundamental principles of personalised care, we said, well, what other options can we deploy to help people? So for us, what we wanted to do through this work was come up with a really core definition. So our definition is that personalised care gives people choice and control over the way their care is planned and delivered based on what matters to them, and building on the strengths, the assets that they bring to their own health. Now, that as a fundamental principle is supported by those first 3 building blocks that I've outlined. That is the way in which we can manage this. Now, just probably a little bit of controversy, because I know that internationally and still in the UK in various guises we refer to person-centered care as a driver, a way of articulating this. We moved away from that term. We felt that person-centered care was a great term. We felt that it really focused on what we were trying to achieve, that it was care centered around the person, but we also felt that it had limitations, because what we wanted to shift with this model was not just making sure that care was fitted better to an individual, but actually that the care delivered was adapted to their personal needs. So that's why we called it personalisation, because we felt that gave a second layer of motivation beyond personalised care. We felt that would start to encouraging the system to change the way it was delivering care to support the individual needs of an individual. And then we went on to then look at 3 other areas. So the first area is self-management support. So how can we improve those skills, knowledge and confidence? Now, the evidence supports this. If you look back to what I was saying in my introduction around 10 to 15 year gap in healthy living and in mortality, what you tend to find is that people that are doing well, people in the most affluent areas of society, have greater connections. They have greater knowledge about their healthcare, and they're able to support themselves more effectively. And the evidence shows that people with the lowest level of activation where their health is concerned, the lowest level of skills, knowledge and confidence, versus the people with the highest level of skills, knowledge and confidence, you have a 38% reduction in hospital admissions and a 19% reduction in GP appointments if you're able to shift somebody from that low level of confidence to that high level of confidence, which is huge, not just for the individual, but also for the system. So we thought, how can we do this? How can we work with people? How can we engage them in their health? So we've started to commit to health coaching. We've started to commit to peer support. We've started to commit to structured education. So somebody newly diagnosed, perhaps with, say, type 2 diabetes, how can we get them linked to somebody that has been living with type 2 diabetes for many years? How can we get them on a course so that they can, go on an online course and learn about their diabetes, learn about ways to support themselves, learn about ways to manage the condition more effectively? How can we get them sat down with a health coach that can help them work on aspects of their life that they like to work on and change to improve their overall health and well-being? The second thing that we put in place was a commitment to rolling out personal health budgets. So these are cash amounts of money that people are able to use to buy services in a way that they can structure themselves. So people living with long-term conditions, long-term needs that need personal and domestic care inside their home can now have NHS resources in order to support themselves to buy the care package that's right for them. So it works in a similar way to the NDIS, but is more targeted to people with certain needs. So people, for example, with a learning disability, people with mental health needs who've been sectioned under the Mental Health Act, people that have continuing healthcare needs and require that domiciliary care support. So, as I say, works in a similar way to the NDIS, but we wanted that as part of the principle. And finally, a big area, which I know is hugely popular in Australia at the moment, led by lots of really forward-thinking people across Australia, is social prescribing. So we know that 1 in 5 GP appointments over here are for non-medical need. People are going to see their GP because they're lonely, socially isolated, they've got housing issues, they've got debt, relationship problems, and actually we were over-medicating the solutions. We were looking at deploying NHS and medical resources to support what effectively are social problems. So we wanted to engage people with social prescribing. We wanted to create the opportunity to link people effectively to community-based assets, to community-based interventions. And we did that by employing a whole army of link workers, 3,500 people in general practice, so that every GP surgery in the country has access to a link worker who's able to sit down with a patient and work out a plan that works for them and help them to connect with their community to help their health improve. And we do this through connection to 4 zones. So the first being arts and culture, so activities like singing for the brain for people with dementia, for example, activities like dance for falls prevention, keeping people's core strength up and helping people to maintain their balance. The second area is sport and exercise, walking football to park run, getting people engaged in physical exercise. We know physical exercise is good for us, but actually some people really struggle to connect to that. The third area is natural environment, nature, being outdoors, creating that opportunity for people to live healthy lives by embracing the natural environment. And finally, knowledge, information, lifelong learning, which I've mentioned in respect of type 2 diabetes as an example of how we can enable people to equip them with more skills. So social prescribing, personal health budgets, self-management support, core ways of delivering a different type of care for people that we feel is much more personalised and takes account of those issues that affect people, because we know of how powerful the social determinants of health are, and accessing those through a shared decision-making conversation, the ability to have choice, and having a holistic personalised care and support plan. So that's how the model comes together. So 6 really core interventions. We've added, since the pandemic, a 7th, which is a program called NHS at Home, which looks at embracing technology to provide to people living with certain circumstances of health. So things like blood pressure monitoring at home. We, during COVID, deployed pulse oximeters to support people at risk of silent hypoxia by enabling them to have a pulse oximeter to measure their oxygen saturation levels. And we're looking at the NHS at Home programme to be a really core way of delivering services closer to people's homes in their community to enable them to live their best life. So what have we done with all of this then? So we are now at the point at which 6.2 million people have benefited from personalised care over the last few years. We set ourselves a target of getting to 2.5 million people benefiting by March of next year. So we've massively outstripped that target, massively exceeded it, and we've been supporting people in new and innovative ways using this model. We now have, as I mentioned, 3,500 link workers who've supported 1.8 million people to access social prescribing, which is in that 6.2 million number. We've supported 150,000 people to benefit from personal health budgets, giving them the choice of deploying NHS resources in a way that matters to them. And really excitingly, not only has that improved outcomes for individuals, but actually personal health budgets are working out 19% cheaper than delivering them direct services. And we've also started expanding the programs beyond the initial outlook as well to start targeting people more proactively. So we're now using personalised care along with population health management principles to look at risk stratifying populations and deploying support to people much more proactively further up the health trajectory. So, this is the focus of the programme now. How can we get to people at that point at which they start the process of decline in their health, at that point at which they're needing interventions in order to prevent them becoming iller further down the line. So, making sure that personalised care is proactive. So I hope that's been a useful trip across what we've done here in England in order to provide people with universal personalised care. The model is still maturing, the model is still shaping up, but I think what we've really learned is that by bringing these things together, by enabling them to act in concert, we get the best impact for people's health and well-being. Not having these things act as silos, pulling it all together, stopping that fragmentation and creating one single model that showed that all of these things that were effectively delivering person-centered care, that were delivering personalization, that were enabling us to engage with people better in their health, is having really strong impacts, not just for the people that we serve, which is the very reason that we do it, but also to benefit the health system and help utilize resources in the most effective way. I hope that's been interesting for you. Really look forward to any questions and really look forward to engaging in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. And I'm pleased to say that we've actually got James here now for the live Q&A session. So I'll introduce James, Director of Community Health Services and Personalised Care, NHS England. Also on our panel today, we have Elaine Cross, who is the peer leader, patient champion and patient peer support volunteer. And we've also got Sian Slade, who is the project founder and chair of Navigating Health, which is an organisation that connects like-minded people across Australia and globally to lead change in healthcare. So thank you all very much for joining us today, particularly James and Elaine. It's very early in England. I think they've been with us since 6:30 this morning, so a huge thank you to them. I'm sure that we're going to have plenty of questions to ask you today. I'm going to kick off the questions whilst we wait for people to put them into the Q&A. James, first one, I'd like to talk to you about the comprehensive care model. It encompasses elements that I think that we're fairly familiar with in Australia and also work to achieve, but I'm really interested how you pulled it together into the comprehensive model. And in particular, I'm interested to hear, how have you managed to get clinician buy-in to do this?
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think the main thing that we observed was that whilst many of these things were happening in various places across the country, it was somewhat fragmented. And when you look at personalised care, you look at approaches to person-centred care, you look at approaches to patient involvement, whatever they may be, actually what we found was that the evidence base on individual measures, on individual inputs is quite tricky to pin down. But when you brought it all together as a more comprehensive suite of shifts that you wanted within the system, actually the evidence base for that entire shift was really compelling. We found that not only did overall it improved patient outcomes, which was obviously the reason that we're doing it, but actually it was much more beneficial to the system as well in relation to cost and efficiency. So actually the bringing it together was more about trying to consolidate that evidence base and create a much more substantial program in order for us to shift it into the mainstream. In terms of clinician buy-in, that's really been mixed. I mean, one of the benefits of the approach that we took was that we were bringing expertise from different areas. A lot of the work on shared decision making had started with surgeons, started with anaesthetists, really looking at informed consent and the way in which they were using structured conversations and decision support tools in order to create that shift. Now, that's very, very different to the world in which personal health budgets started, which is a 1970s disability rights movement, nothing about us without us, and disabled people as a social movement moving forward with wanting more choice and control. But actually, when you looked into those two elements, the same things operating, the same impetus to improve support for people by focusing on themselves is really, really key. So I think getting clinicians on board through that understanding of how this links to their clinical practice has been really important for us.
Great, thank you. Sian, I know that you talk to people across Australia and globally around navigating the health system. Do you see a system like this working in Australia?
I do. I think we have several differences with the UK system at the moment, which look like they may be changing. So as you know, in the UK, it's a capitation model for payment. In Australia, it's an episodic care model or activity-based care. There is a lot of move to a value-based healthcare type setting here in terms of not just thinking about clinical outcomes of morbidity and mortality, but thinking about what James said, which is what matters to the patient and what are the outcomes that matter. And how can we sort of develop, if you like, a model that works emotionally for the patient so that they get the right care at the right time with the right cost every time, but also is working sort of that we can actually afford to pay for it as a health system. So I think there are more common and consistent things globally than there are differences. And I think it's wonderful to have this webinar and this forum to be discussing these things because as many people in the audience know, the transfer of knowledge globally can be quite slow. We might have evidence happening in different parts of the world, but to date, I think the figure is something like 30 years for it to sort of transfer across the world. And if we think about what's important to us as people and patients and people that we look after, it's our health. And so if we've got great things happening, I think it's really important to make that visible and quite frankly, accelerate that diffusion of innovation and normalization globally so that we're not all repeating what might have been done in different parts of the world and how we collaborate and work together, not just at a national level, but at a global level, so that we can sort of divide and conquer, if you like, in terms of we've only got so many resources, that how can we learn from each other and create a system that really comes together. So a bit of a long answer, Anna, but I hope that answers your question. Yeah,
thank you. Good points. Elaine, you're a peer leader, patient champion and patient peer support volunteer. Can you tell us a little bit about what that involves and what you do?
Oh gosh, yes. I'm a peer leader, which means I've undergone the peer leadership development programme with NHS England, which I found was absolutely marvellous. I'd been acting as I suppose you'd call a patient voice in my local surgery and primary care network. And I found that, and to be part of our peer leader network, which is a national organisation supported by NHS England, to be really valuable to help me in being able to talk to professionals and to go into situations where I could be seen as an equal and use the vocabulary and so on. As a patient peer support volunteer, that came about because of a need within my local GP practice to change the management of, first of all, type 2 diabetes, and then sort of rolled out to a lot of people with long-term conditions. And it harks back to something James was talking about earlier about activation and looking at patient activation. And what we did was to effectively triage patients into 4 activation groups, which meant that those with a light touch got a light touch, and those who needed it got the intervention. This was allied to using a sort of health coaching approach and treating patients as a whole. And I'm a living example of how successful that is, because it helped me get from the sort of, depending on the surgery, having my hand held to get into going to a local gym with a group of other patients, which I would never have done on my own. So there are some, it's, and the other thing about it is that this doesn't just benefit patients. It was about making more of what you've got. And so healthcare professionals were then freed up to have the time to be able to deal with patients in the way that they've been trained to do. And I think that for those who were involved in that, I've definitely seen that. And we've taken that a step further in terms of a multidisciplinary team approach towards patients with type 2 diabetes within our primary care network. And we have a special clinic, we call it a life-enhancing diabetes session, where we have all the different people that James was describing in terms of, social prescribing link workers, health coaches, people from local community who could help out with addressing language and cultural barriers of patients. And it's been extremely helpful. And part of that has also been patient-led activity to support patients and take them through, a program. It's run by patients for patients to help them manage their diabetes better. And we've had a lot of success with that. So when you bring those things together, good things happen.
Great answer, Elaine. And in fact, I think you've answered there's a question here directed to James, but I think you've covered quite a bit of it off there. This question is, James, at the beginning, you said this operated over 3 levels. Can you talk about how it applies as a prevention model for the general population, particularly for those most at risk of decline in later life who do not have higher levels of education or wealth?
It's multi-layered, that question. It's a really great question, actually. I think one of the challenges here is that we tend to focus in, most healthcare systems that I've seen on very much downstream emergency response or a sort of patch up and repair service, and that sort of transactional model of care that I spoke about. And as Elaine's been speaking, in order to engage people much more effectively, we've got to shift our focus quite considerably. And moving upstream in people's health trajectory is the key to, improving outcomes for individuals, but also enabling healthcare systems to be sustainable, because it is cheaper to treat people and prevent illness than it is to repair them when they're broken. That's fairly obvious, but actually, if you think about the way in which we invest in healthcare systems, it tends to be in building hospitals and wards and beds and clinicians at that end of the line. So the real key here, the sort of operating at 3 layers, we've got to support people with that really intensive need, that significant multimorbidity, people that have really challenging circumstances. We've got to look at people living with one or more long-term condition, but there is the need to also apply this to a whole population. And within that, you're looking at both primary and secondary prevention. We know that the social barriers that people face, if you deploy social prescribing early enough, if you're getting people connected to their communities, if you're helping support them with exercise and movement, if you're helping them support them with loneliness and isolation, getting them linked to activities, that can have a massive impact on health. And when you look at those people living in the poorest areas versus those people living in the most affluent areas, a lot of what you find is that lack of connection, that lack of agency, that lack of skills, knowledge, and confidence to be able to change their health outcome is what separates people. So trying to use that as a way of leveling up can really show an impact on the whole population health.
Thanks. And presumably the work that Elaine does involves talking to different agencies across different sectors. So referring back to what Sian mentioned earlier, does that require a commitment to funding across different sectors? Or do they sit within the NHS? But we always struggle with this in Australia in terms of who's paying for what. And that one's to you, James, I think.
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's ongoing debate all the time about this here in the UK, as well as there is in many other countries. Health systems obviously have a responsibility to fund support for people, but actually it is also limited in my eyes around the way in which activities like social prescribing should be funded. I don't personally believe it should be the preserve of the health system in a country. I think that it should be responsibility across all sectors, and not just looking at government at both the national and the local level, looking at private industry as well. Private companies should be putting support in to ensure that their workers are healthy, for example, and have access to things. And I think this is something that's got to be embraced at that wider societal level. A lot of people challenge me in saying, well, the NHS, should be paying for community choir, should be paying for arts-based activities. And I really reject that because, we are talking about not over-medicalising solutions here. We're talking about people being part of society. The worst thing to do for a community choir is to let the NHS run it. The NHS is an institution that focuses on healthcare, not on cultural and creativity. And I think, that's why the conversation has to be taken much wider than just health departments in every country. This is about the way in which we want our society to be.
Interesting. And Elaine, when you're talking to people and you're making recommendations for things like a community choir, is that the kind of thing you talk to people about, or is yours a bit more clinical focused?
No, I'm not a clinician.
Right.
My role is there are two aspects to what I do. One is in terms of providing the sort of patient point of view and being involved in using that to shape health services. The other part is acting as a peer support volunteer. I mean, we did that locally, and we have an induction for people who want to do that kind of thing, so that it's very clear, what the boundaries are and so on. What we do is, for example, in we have a four session thing we call our Kickstart group. That tends to be facilitated by patients like me, and that's to help people get a little bit of a basic understanding about their diabetes, and also to start thinking about where the carbohydrates lurk in their diet, and then getting on to a bit of goal setting and how they can take that forward. We have a remission through diet group, but that is led by our clinical lead because it needs much more clinical oversight. And then we have a patient peer support cafe where people come to the surgery, and we have a little cafe. And what's interesting is that those informal conversations when we're in the clinic in our life enhancing diabetes session, help to prime patients so that when they see, I don't know, the health coach or the diabetic nurse, whoever, we've already sown the seeds in terms of thinking about how they might take forward their situation and sort of supporting people through their journey. And I have to say that although this particular project has only been running since before Christmas, we've had a number of patients go through and they've all made changes to their living. And that's because they've had that peer, I think largely peer support backed up by the other health professionals who were present at the clinic. I don't know if that answers your question.
It definitely does, and we're getting more questions on what you're saying there, Elaine. How do you actually receive training in advance to do this role? Is there a package that you enroll in?
Right. I mean, there are two aspects to it. One in terms of what I'd call the patient voice work, and that has as I said previously, doing the peer leadership development program with NHS England has made a massive difference to my ability to be able to carry out that role. And I'm on the NHS Lived Experience Strategic Co-Production Group, which operates at national level. And the other peer leaders I've met in the network that we have been incredibly supportive. They're a lovely bunch of people. I've learned so much from them. And having that behind me makes a big difference in terms of my, we talk about knowledge, skills and confidence in being able to sort of advance the patient point of view. The other side is in terms of the peer support work, which we've done locally, and we developed a patient peer support volunteer induction, which took care of things like some of the legalities around ensuring people had their what we call DBS checks. It's to make sure that people are okay from a legal point of view, and also being very clear about boundaries, getting people to sign up to confidentiality, and so on, so that we've got that for those who would like to go a step further from our patient group, which we're forming, so that they can become more active as patients themselves. Because I think this is quite important in terms of the things that James is talking about, because the powers that be need to know what it's like to live with things, and what's best for us, how we see it. But also when you're talking to other people who are like you, that can really be very, very helpful in being able to help you manage your own condition.
Thanks, Elaine. And there's a question in regards to whether there are similar opportunities like this in Australia. I know that within health services, there can certainly be these sorts of opportunities. But Sian, I was wondering if you'd come across any, James referred to them as, I think, pockets of practice earlier in his presentation. Is there anything you've come across in Australia?
I think there's lots happening in Australia. I think one of the key focus areas that we have for Navigating Health is connecting it all up, because there's some great work going on. And I think sometimes, and Elaine, to pick up from what you said, when you're a patient, you might think you know the health system, but when you become a patient, you actually realize you don't know it quite as well as you thought you might. You actually feel pretty vulnerable. There might be other things going on in your life at the same time, and you sort of find yourself in a situation that you thought that you didn't know, added to other complexities that might be going on in your life, not to do with your health. This starts to create a situation that's really, really challenging. So what we started a couple of years ago was really just uncovering all the great work that's happening in Australia and starting to glue it all together. And that essentially is what we started as a national network, and that's what we've taken global. And I think that's the key thing, is that there's a phrase, isn't there, that, look for the people who are helping. And there are many, many people helping across Australia. And what we've tried to do is make sure we connect people together. And what we're also trying to do is coalesce some of the activities. So particularly for things with social prescribing, there's an informal but very active informal network across Australia who are highly connected in terms of how we start to bring these things through. I agree with the comments also made around this is not just a responsibility of government. This is a responsibility of all of us. And if we're to sort of have a system, a social and health system that works for us, we have to be part of that agency in making that happen. And I think part of that sort of inspiration, and Elaine, you've really touched on that for me in terms of what you've talked about. I think even the fact of enabling people to have conversations, you talked about sort of people being primed before their appointment. I think what it does is it gives people the confidence to have these conversations that they might otherwise feel quite vulnerable about raising with somebody else. And when they talk to somebody else and somebody else says, oh, I went through exactly the same thing and I did this, they start to say, oh, I've never talked to somebody about that before. And it starts to normalize a conversation that really should be, I think we should be more comfortable about having in trusted circumstances. And I think then it opens out a conversation that we feel more comfortable to have with others. And that goes to James's point around sort of self-management. And Anna, back to your point, Menzies Institute, Victoria University under Rosemary Calder have done some great work in terms of the blueprint for self-care. I guess ideally what we're all trying to move to is a model that James described where we've got, people who can potentially self-care, really self-caring, people who need a bit of help, having some help, and people who are more complex, who might need more help, sort of able to access those services. So absolutely, there's stuff happening here. I think the key thing for all of us, including all of us on the call, is connecting it up and continuing to bring work together, to share and collaborate and not continue to sort of perpetuate in silos.
Thanks, Jeanne. James, can you explain a little bit more about the personalised care plan to us and how that works?
Sorry, the personalised care. Sorry,
Plan.
yeah, I know you can tell. The plan, well, the recognition that looking holistically at people's needs and starting to try and bring that together in a comprehensive single plan has been really fundamentally important. And Elaine and other members of our peer support group have been strategic co-production group have been incredibly helpful in designing this. Designing something that works very much for the individuals in which it's intended for. And I think back to your first question, we wouldn't really have been able to achieve any of this shift if it wasn't for working with people with lived experience. And that personalised care and support plan has been, one of the things that people with lived experience have cited as being really fundamental. That sense of having all of your needs documented, something that you can use from appointment to appointment, something that is there to ensure that your care is delivered in a way in which you need it to be delivered, has been a fundamental principle from the very beginning. Now, this isn't about having a single assessment necessarily. A lot of people really strive for, well, we just need people to have one assessment. Well, that doesn't work. A social worker will bring very different skills to an occupational therapist, to a physio. You've got to have different professionals involved. But what's really important is that those different professionals don't start with the basics. You can't, you're adding value. So when an occupational therapist goes into somebody's home after a social worker's visited, you'd expect them to be picking up the same plan that's been completed for them and then adding value using their professional expertise, not starting with what's your name, what's your date of birth, what conditions do you have, what medications you're on. All of that should be captured and should be shared. And that's something that, we've still got a long way to go to have that fully interoperable, fully shareable. But that's got to be the goal in order to make this work.
And so are they electronic, the plans? Are they something online?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of systems now that will support the use of electronic plans. A lot of general practices have invested in those systems. I don't, whilst we concentrate on IT and digital solutions, which are fantastic in this space. I think we shouldn't lose sight of a physical plan being provided to somebody and them having that opportunity to use that as they need. I think that's, you know, really important as well. I think, you know, this we have this sort of obsession with how we join up systems, join up processes, join up, you know, digital architecture, and, you know, I'm not doubting that needs to be done, that needs to be a challenge, but actually the person that can join up systems most effectively is the individual patient themselves. Give them all of the information that they need, let them join the system. You're eradicating any need for data protection law and all sorts of issues like that. The patient holds the records, the patient's got the information, they're taking to appointment, they're consenting by sharing that information with whoever they need to in order to get the care that they require.
Right. This is a question that has come up over our previous webinars as well, relating to often we'll have consumer representatives that work in health systems, and sometimes it can be difficult to get diversity due to who's available and who can spend their time volunteering. So I'll direct this one to you, Elaine, initially. Is there a variation of age and diversity across peer navigators, and how is that ensured?
Certainly within the peer leader network, there's an element of that. It has been a difficulty, I have to say, at local level, but because we have very good links with different community organisations from different parts of our community, then we're beginning to address that. So one of the things that I'm involved in is a project which is for my city, Sheffield, which is the Sheffield Diabetes Action Hub. And that's brought together all community organisations to look at providing support for patients within and their families within that within our city. And that's the good thing about it, is that we've got people from all parts of our community involved in that. And we're very mindful of being able to address it. It's not always easy, but we've been lucky in some of the contacts that we've made. And I would say that one part of this conversation needs to be about the use of community organisations. And I'm going a little bit off topic here, but for example, coping with inequality of access, one of the things that happens in community organisations is digital inclusion work. So we've been looking at trying to bring together the digital inclusion stuff with the disadvantaged parts of our community in order to improve their ability to, use some of the online tools and so on. So I think you can't really have this discussion because if you're going to treat the patient in the whole, then you need, a much wider range of things that you are going to help them with.
Thanks, Elaine. Now we're getting close towards the end of the webinar. I'm going to go around each panel member and ask, what's the one thing that's probably the thing that you'd like to change, or the most challenging thing for you in this space at the moment? And I'm going to start with James.
Oh, that's a tough question to I could give you 100 things, probably very much quicker than I can give you one thing. I think the biggest issue for me at the moment in running sort of community health services is this need to shift the system focus away from the downstream intervention. The way in which we judge and focus on the health service is on elective care, A&E performance, ambulance performance, the impact of work that's going on in hospitals effectively. And that, is fairly obvious, and it's important and it's necessary to have all of those functions in society. Of course, we need those, but actually the focus of attention on the health service there really, I think, creates a barrier for us doing what we need to do, which is actually to support people much earlier on in their lives. And I think that's a real challenge. You know, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be focusing on people who are frail at 79 years of age, but, you know, a huge amount of work goes into supporting people who are frail in hospital. 50% of people over the age of 65. You know, it makes up the people admitted to hospital. But actually, we need to be getting to those 79-year-olds when they're 59, when they're 49, and we need to start changing their health then. And that's the point of intervention. And that's, you know, a real challenge, I think.
Yeah. Sian, one thing you'd change?
I think the key thing is exactly what has been talked about today, is around connection. And actually, James will probably start smiling, and I don't know if this will show on the screen. I'm reading The Connected Community, which is a book by Cormac Russell and John McKnight. And for many of you on the call who know about ABCD, which is asset-based community development, it starts with us. You know, James talked at the beginning about nothing about us without us. Well, we are the us, all of us. And we have an opportunity to, through our informal arrangements, sort of work in communities. And if you look at some of the King's Fund work, it's very much around place-based care and really thinking about communities. Elaine touched on this too with the Sheffield Diabetes Action Hub. I think resources are local. And if we're looking to make change, you know, we can't make these macro changes overnight, but we can make micro changes overnight. And that's literally by checking on the neighbours. It's just, you know, it's having these informal support groups. They don't cost anything apart from our time. So I think, Anna, my answer to you on that one would be around connection. And that's something that we can all do, and we can all do it very easily.
Thanks, Sian. And last word on this one from Elaine.
Gosh, it's like James, I'm thinking there are 101 things you could probably say. I think it goes, integration, I think, is a key thing for me, is ensuring that whatever you're doing at whatever level is that it's integrated, that they dovetail together. A big problem we have is with silos. People mention that word quite a lot, but it's a real problem, I think. And integration is not just within the sort of health service itself, but also its integration with the community, and ensuring that we have that much broader base to support people. So yeah, I think that's a key thing for me.
Thank you, Elaine. And I'd like to thank all of our panelists. It's been fantastic to get a bit of an insight into NHS England. We are due to send out our newsletter in the next few weeks that's based off the back of these person-centred care webinars. So as part of that, we'll include a link to Sian's Navigating Health website that a few people have been asking about. And we'll also provide some of the resources we've been talking about here. And if anyone wants to share anything with that network, please get in touch with us as well. And we're trying to make that a little bit more interactive and a bit more connected. But a massive thanks to particularly James and Elaine, who have joined us very early in the morning in England. And we hope the sun's still shining. It was half an hour ago, but who knows, it could be snowing by now. And massive thanks to Sian as well for joining us. And thank you everyone for joining us.